I do this podcast, and every once in a while, I shouldn't say once in a while, quite often I get the feeling I'm dealing in things way larger than I am. And this is going to be one of those episodes that I feel like are going to kind of be touchstone moments here for us as Mormons, no matter where you are, whether you're LDS or whether you're um, a member of a fundamentalist group or an independent. I feel like this is one of those stories and a conversation that we're going to be able to extract a lot from. Today's guest is Ammon Jeffs, and he's the son of Warren Jeffs. And I feel like he not only does his story need to be told, but I think he's got some things that we can all learn from on how to preserve faith even when things seem to go completely off the rails. So, Ammon, again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you reaching out and dropping me that email. It means more than you know, sir.
Well, thanks for having me on. And it's been a real privilege to listen to the podcast the last year and a half or so.
Well, I appreciate that. So real quick, you're the son of Warren Jeffs.
Yes, I was born in 1990, so that was a few years after the groups in Short Creek had split. And my grandfather was the leader at the time I was born. And my father was just an elder in the group.
Okay, was this back when he was teaching school like in Sandy in that area or
Yes, these were his Alta Academy days
right on?
in Sandy.
And how long did you live in Sandy before you guys moved out to Short Creek permanently?
I was 8 years old when we moved out, and we didn't really come back up to the Salt Lake area after that.
Okay,
Once we moved to the creek in 98.
gotcha. Now, if I'm not mistaken, when you guys moved down there, it was kind of the idea that hey, the end times are getting close and you guys wanted to kind of hunker down out there. Is that kind of the general gist of what spurred them moving everyone down there?
Yeah, so I think it started with Leroy Johnson saying that he felt like the end times had come around the year 2000, and that was really emphasized as I was growing up. So my father, who was the first counselor, because they had set up a church and had made his father president and him first counselor, Fred Jessup the second counselor, he really pushed the idea that around the year 2000, the judgments would come, this country would fall apart, and you needed to be in Short Creek. And maybe if you were somewhere else or were supposed to be somewhere else, you would be lifted up and set down in Short Creek.
Gotcha.
But that was a lot of why everyone moved down there.
Gotcha. And do you remember that time? Do you remember moving down there and stuff?
Yes, very much. I remember that we were told that my grandfather wanted us to move down. And this was just a few months after he had had a stroke
Hmm.
and been quite incapacitated. And my father really kind of took over at that time of the major decisions of what went on. So, what was it mostly his decision? I believe it was more than my grandfather's. But and I remember really well moving to Short Creek. And as a child, I thought it was great fun. We were moving to a new place.
Sure. Kind of an adventure, right? I mean,
Yeah.
yep. I moved my kids across the country a couple of times, right? Once we moved from Maryland, from Boise out to Maryland, and then back, and then to North Dakota. So, yeah, for the littler kids, it's always kind of an adventure, right? We're gonna go see some
Yeah.
neat stuff. So when you got down there, what'd you think when you got there?
We, for the most part, got involved with the community, especially I'm my father's third son. So I had two brothers just older than me. And we would go to the community zoo every Saturday, clean out the animal pens, or go work in the big community garden that was in the center of town,
Okay,
or any work project on Saturday because the community banded together for work projects.
gotcha.
And in those days, then everything seemed pretty chill there in the creek. When we first moved down, there was a lot more events in the community, celebrations for things like the 4th of July or the Harvest Festival in the fall. Other celebrations, the 24th, we had a parade in town. Us older boys joined the marching boys that was there in Short Creek. So I quite enjoyed that as a young boy.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And then growing up, those first 8 years of your life as you're in Sandy, what were those years like in comparison?
I don't remember anything strange or bad myself when I was growing up. I didn't know what was going on in the dark corners, but for me, it was just fun because we had the mountain right across the street, and then
Hmm.
school was next door at my grandfather's, the private school. So to me, it was a pretty relaxed and fun life as a child.
Okay. So you get to Short Creek and everything seems really cool right there. You said at first everything's going really well. Um, you're involved with the community. When when's the first time you can remember feeling like, okay, something's different now. Something has changed, right? Does that making sense?
Yeah. So, of course, the first year we moved down, the one strange thing that happened was my father got 10 new wives that year. So we had seven mothers when we moved down in the end of 98. And by the end of 99, we had 17. And that seemed a little bit strange to me, but I was still 9 years old. So I didn't think a whole lot about it. And things really picked up at the time my grandfather died in 2002, September of 2002. And when he had passed away, everyone had been told for years and years by my father and other men that my grandfather would be totally renewed and made into a young person again, and he would be the last prophet. And I suppose you understand in the FLDS that those men were considered the prophet, like as much as Russell Nelson is considered the prophet in the LDS Church.
Right. It's a one man kind of a thing, right? There's one man guiding
Yes,
the whole thing, and and you know, almost approaching godhood, right? If that's not too much
correct.
to take.
Oh, very much so. And we'll get into that later.
Okay. All right. So you see this start to happen. Does it just feel weird, or does it start taking on kind of a darker feeling?
So I was 12 at the time and barely been ordained a deacon. And when my father took over, he had other people stand up in church and bear testimony that his father had appointed him. And they used, I think it's section 43 of the Doctrine and Covenants, that where it says to Joseph Smith, if he wasn't faithful, he would appoint another in his stead, and saying that one prophet appoints the next one before he dies. And at first, it seemed like quite an enthusiastic feeling spread throughout the community. I know there were members that didn't like it and kind of went away with a group in Canada with Winston Blackmore. But for the most part, the community became quite enthusiastic with this new prophet, and he was young, and he did a pretty good job of trying to put it across to the people that he was almost a replica of Joseph Smith.
Hmm.
And within a few months, he started receiving revelations and reading them to the people and started to really set things in order with the church. So he appointed a high council, he appointed a presiding bishop, he appointed a presiding patriarch. And everyone seemed to think that work of God's moving forward, the church is being set in order, and maybe the prophet Joseph's coming to Warren and telling him what to do. That was the feeling I remember among the people. And in the middle of 2003, then he suddenly shut the meetings down because the people had made a slideshow about the 53 raid and built a monument to Uncle Roy. And for whatever reason, that offended him, and he came out with a revelation that God was angry with the people, and he shut the meetings down completely. Well, what we didn't know at the time was he was already traveling throughout the United States and buying land to start new communities.
Mm.
And his intention was to abandon Short Creek in the long run.
Really? Where was Texas always the spot in mind?
He started with Colorado, small place in Colorado, about 140 acres. And then he bought Texas and that place up by Pringle, South Dakota. So he had three places purchased in pretty short order.
God.
And then he gathered up men and some women that he felt like were the most trustable of the community. And he would give them quite like an 8 hour, I can't say for sure how long the training was, but it was quite a long training process that he would run people through before he let them come to those places. And he told them, anybody that went there, that this was the redemption of Zion starting again, where Joseph Smith left off. So this was supposed to be a preparatory work to the people going back to Jackson County, Missouri,
Mm-hmm.
and a place where he claimed the Lord would gather whoever was faithful. And he also told us, as people went there, that Short Creek would be driven. In other words, the FLDS and Short Creek would be driven out of Short Creek like the Saints were in the old days by the Missourians in Missouri. So he said it would be mobs, killings, all the things that happened in Joseph's day. And he gave revelations to the people to prove it, because that, of course, would bring his word to people without question if he could come with a revelation.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So it sounds like he's already starting to try to consolidate power, right? Now, at this point, I do have a couple of questions. Going back, what was your relationship with your dad prior to this time, right? Was the relationship good? I mean, how would you describe your relationship with your father during those years prior to him taking over the reins of power in the FLDS Church?
So before he became the first counselor, then I feel like I had a really good relationship with him. And even after, up until the time my grandfather died, I felt like my relationship was pretty good. And I wouldn't say that I had the chance to be as close to him as I would have liked to. I remember always wishing I could have a closer relationship with my father, and I didn't know why I couldn't get closer than I was.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken finding out everything that was going on to bring that to my understanding.
Gotcha.
He put the responsibility of a child parent relationship on the child, not the parent. And so he made it my responsibility to get close to him, and it wasn't his to get close to me as his son. But I didn't know what to do to make it better. I didn't feel like he didn't love me as a child, but I felt like I had a father until I was about 12 years old.
Okay.
And then he was gone most of the time after that.
Gotcha. Phew, that is such a crazy thought that, that it's your responsibility to go seek out a relationship with your father, right? I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
understand big families. I'm a proponent of big families, obviously. But putting that on a kid, that's rough stuff, bro. Um, Holy cow. Okay, so and this question here, and then I'll let you pick up with your story again. So you talked about the thing about where he was kind of upset that they had built a memorial to Leroy Johnson, right? Who
Mm-hmm.
by all accounts seems like a guy who really loved his people, right? Um,
Right.
I'm curious, what was your dad's relationship in terms of teaching from other prophets' words, right? Would he go back to your dad much? Would he go back to Joseph or Brigham or John Taylor? What was he teaching regularly from those guys' teachings?
Yes, so he predominantly taught from Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and then Leroy Johnson and his father, Ammon Jeffs. Those were, and he quoted them all the time. Like he teaches with their words. Most of the time, his sermons are reading some of their words and then expounding on them, and then reading more of that and expounding on them. And you can listen to a sermon he gives and be like, oh, that sounds really good. That sounds like the gospel. And it's just the little things you slip in there that give him power to decide everything in your life. And he can take a quote from Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, and especially to a people that he's taught to not question what he says, then he can tell them what they meant when they gave that sermon or that revelation in those early days.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Let me ask you this question because you said something else that was kind of interesting. You said that he had taught them not really to question him, right? He had taught the people not to
Correct.
question him. Do you feel like that's something that he inherited from his dad or his dad inherited from somebody else? What's your thoughts on that? Where's that come from?
Well, if his dad gets it from somebody else, it would be from the church when he was
Okay.
in the church. And so Leroy Johnson would say if what we say at the pulpit doesn't square with the 3-in-1 Book of
Right.
Mormon Doctrine and Covenants for a great price, then you can throw it out. And he didn't really stick with that. He said what the prophet says is the word of God and you shouldn't question it. And that's still a big thing in the FLDS. If you start to voice a disagreement about something that's said by him, the first thing another member will ask you is, are you questioning the prophet?
Okay. Okay. So it sounds like Leroy Johnson starts out by like, hey, make sure everything squares with the scriptures. And then by the time it gets to your dad, if I'm understanding correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, by the time it gets to your dad, it's, hey, if the prophet says this is the way it is, this is the way it is. You don't have to question anymore because the answer's here.
Correct. And he pushed that really hard in his father's day too.
Okay,
So my generation's grown up with that
I got
their
you.
whole life. That's all they know.
I got you. So questioning is not only is it looked down upon, it's probably pretty scary for your generation, right? It probably is like the major sign to apostasy, I imagine is how they would look at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could also be sent away if you ask their own questions. So there's a lot of implications if you start asking questions.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, so we talked here just a second about Warren Jeffs going out and buying other properties and telling his, I guess, kind of his inner circle or the people he felt would be most loyal to him, if that's a correct assessment there, that hey, we're getting ready for the really rough times to right before we go back to Jackson County and those sorts of things. What happens next? What's the progression of things?
So I came to Texas in July of 2004, and my mother had had cancer. I don't remember exactly when she got it, but she had had it for over a year, breast cancer. And he had taken her children from her in November of '03. She didn't know where they went or anything, but a few of us older ones stayed there in the creek with her. She went there in June of '04, and then I followed in July.
Okay.
And she died the night I got there in
Oh, I'm
Texas.
so sorry.
So it was kind of a rough start when I went there,
Oh yeah.
but he put me on a work crew right away. I had to listen to all the trainings he had given to the people that were living down there and then be on the work crew. And so I'm 14 at this time. And the way he operated was he would give building projects, whether it was a home or a meeting house. eventually the temple, and give a time it had to be accomplished in. And his time schedules were extremely tight. So you'd have a house and it would have to be done in a month. And these are originally, we kind of started with 7,500 square foot houses, but some of them were way bigger than that. And if you didn't meet the time schedule he set, he would claim that God's condemnation would be upon us. And he would tell us that God was so angry with us, he was about to destroy us from off the face of the earth.
Oh.
But that he would pray to God to give us another chance and would atone for us. And first, I didn't understand what he meant by that until probably December of 2004. He called a special meeting and taught what he called the doctrine of him atoning for us. And basically, what he claimed was, in his capacity, he was suffering the same type of suffering Jesus was when he was on the cross for the people if they didn't do things just right. So he claimed he was going through terrible pain every time we did something wrong, because if he didn't, then God would destroy us. And to this day, that doctrine spread among pretty much all the FLDS people. At first, it was just the people on these places. He called them places of refuge. And it spread to everyone hears that kind of stuff now. And they think that this man is suffering like a savior for them. And that's even why he's in prison. They hear it all the time. They're not worthy for him to come out. And he's suffering for them still.
Man, that is rough. I mean, it's rough on a couple accounts, right, Ammon? Because I mean, on one account, it's like if you don't meet a deadline, you're fearing the wrath of God come upon you, right? I mean, and
Mm-hmm.
then also he's kind of putting himself in the not kind of, he's absolutely putting himself in the place of the Savior, right?
Right.
Which is kind of concerning, right? Because you start looking at it and you're like, okay, well, if he's suffering like the Savior, does that mean he has the same authority as the Savior, right? Does he have that same ability to dictate, right? I mean, that really opens up the door for some stuff, right?
Right. Right. And I'll say the dark things he was doing there was very secretive and restricted to the very few people in his inner circle. I'm talking even in his own family. So just the wives or whoever he was involved with in the things people have probably seen on the internet in his trial and all that was very secretive. So the people in general in those places didn't know all that was going on, except that he would take those very young girls and say that God had commanded him to marry them. So that's another thing that was going on at the same time as we were building these places. And it was only known to the people on those places that he did that. And even to this day, I would say the general people in the FLDS think that he took these young girls as wives just to protect them. And he actually wasn't living with them as wives. And I've heard people say that clear up until I left. So what he did and was doing is still pretty secret from the FLDS people in general.
Ooh. So is that where you spent the remainder of your time while you were in the FLDS, is down in Texas?
So we were there. I went there in 2004. Then we had the raid in 2008. And we kind of gathered back there in about a year after the raid. And I was down there until 2012. In 2012, then the state of Texas filed a case to take the land away from him because I believe that he was on the trust name.
Mm-hmm.
So they filed the case and he didn't fight it. And in 2014, they seized that whole community down there and have since auctioned it off to a law enforcement training group. So
Okay.
that's all it's used for at this time. It's inaccessible unless you're law enforcement going there for training at this time.
Gotcha.
So we left there in 2012 to 2014, and then he had a place in South Dakota and Colorado. And I spent time at those places also.
Hold on one second. I want to ask a question about the raids, right? Is it? And let me ask you this. We kind of stop there for a minute while I ask questions about, your time on a work crew and that sort of thing. I want to stop there for a minute because it's from the way you described it. You got down there, your mom dies the night you get there, and then is it like the next day you're on a work crew?
Yes.
Did your father like try to come to you and comfort you or anything like that after your mom died? I mean, did he make any sort of overtures or gestures to you?
No, he didn't really. Didn't have much time to talk to him at all after
Okay.
that. And then he left like the next day.
What were you
So,
thinking?
well, let's see. She died and they got her body ready. He had the funeral the next day, buried her, and he left.
Whew. And what are you thinking at this point? I mean, dude, that's a lot, right? You have left, realistically, you said you went to Texas when you were 14? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you leave when you're 14,
Yes.
go to Short Creek, and you get there, your mom passes, you don't have much time to talk to your dad. You're put on a work crew immediately. What's going through your mind at this point?
So let's back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
When he took my younger siblings in November and took them to those places, he told the rest of us that we had to qualify to be there. We had to repent of our sins, and he had to have God personally tell him we could go there. And he brought me down to a city nearby to see my mother because she was in the hospital. And then he told me I had to go back to Short Creek and she was going to die. So when I was about halfway back to Short Creek, he calls and says, "The Lord's name you to come there." And so we turned around and we had about 9 hours to drive to get back to Texas to his place there so I could see her before she died. And when I got there, she was unconscious. So I actually didn't get to speak to her again after I got there.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So once your mom passes, you're in Texas. What are you thinking? I mean, what's going through your mind as this is happening?
Um, Losing her was really hard, but I was happy that I finally got to come there. And that's where most of my family was at that point. And my siblings were all there. And then, of course, we'd been taught it was such a great privilege to come work on a place like that to help build up Zion.
Okay.
And I didn't even have a whole lot of time to sit there and think about the loss of my mother because I was put on the work crew and he had some really tight schedules set up. And we were working from about 6 a.m. till 2 the next morning. That was the schedule when I got there.
Holy cow. So you're like working 20 hours a day, literally.
Correct. Yes.
Whew. So at what
And it
point?
was so
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Ammon.
no, the work schedules were so intense that it was like that for 2 years after I got there, 2.5 years or so.
So you really have no time to process any of this.
No, that time was just a jumble of deadlines. That's what I remember it as. Hardly any sleep. And a teenager, teenagers sleep like a rock.
Right.
But I didn't get hardly any sleep until I was 16. Then we got to go to bed at 11 about the time I turned 16.
Gotcha. Gotcha. What was your dad's what would your dad tell you about the outside world, right? What would he say first about the world in general? And then two, what would he say about other fundamentalists, right? Other Mormons. What were some of his takes on that?
Of course, the outside world he told us was very wicked. and was seeking our destruction. And that was their aim and goal. He said the government powers and apostates were out to kill him, and he was supposed to hide from the law because if they took him, they would kill him. Other fundamentalists and LDS, any other fundamentalists, he considers them apostate to this day. You don't talk to them, don't listen to them. They're all apostate. We're the one true church. And the LDS Church has been apostate since 1890. So that's how they're looked upon to this day by the FLDS. And that's the reason you don't really have FLDS associated with anybody outside of the FLDS, because all other groups or individuals are considered apostates.
Right. Whew, okay. Boy, I'm sorry. I'm trying to digest all this. Um, I want to back up to the raids as well. Did you guys know that the raids were coming at all? I mean, because like I can tell you that in those days, I remember hearing about it in the news, even before the raids, right? There were rumblings that things were going on,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. Did you guys, the general population of the church, did you guys have any feeling or any idea of what was coming with those raids?
The raid was quite a surprise to me. I don't remember us even being worried it was going to happen. My father had said before that he thought the government would come against us and try to come on the land, but then he went to prison, and we kind of thought that would be over because the real reason for them to come before that was because he was running from the law and was on FBI's most wanted list.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't happen. He was caught in Nevada.
Right. Okay. What was it like to have to go through those raids?
We thought it was persecution, the world coming against the church, trying to destroy it. And we were trying to live a form of the United Order there. So we felt like because he had taught us that if we tried to live the United Order, the devil would come against us harder. And we felt like it was an effort on the government's part to destroy the fundamentalist movement. We really didn't think of anybody else as fundamentalists but ourselves
Gotcha.
because everyone else was considered an apostate.
Right. So the picture, the table's been set, so to speak, right? It is that the entire outside world is wicked. Those other Mormons that profess to be Mormon, they're apostates. The only true believers are situated on these various FLDS owned compounds, correct?
Correct. And Short Creek he said it was cursed. He even went there and did some sort of ordinance to curse it or to wash his feet against it, and said everyone would be driven from there. The only safe place would be these lands. And so Short Creek was looked down upon too, especially if you were on one of these lands that he had bought.
Oh,
And so the raid, but we felt like they were coming against this new work that had been started.
okay. And that's an interesting thought. So a new work that has started. So he's really trying um to kind of show that, hey, everything that's been done up to this point is something different. We're doing something new now. Is that kind of the way it felt?
Correct.
Okay.
And this was eventually supposed to be where all the faithful of the FLDS would be. And you can see we built a temple in Texas, and that was the biggest place. And we had a constant manufacture of homes going on there, new homes. We had over 25 before we left there.
Wow. And so basically anyone left in Short Creek, you could the rest of the membership would probably kind of look down their nose at them because if you were righteous, according to the idea, you would be on one of these other properties.
That's correct. And the ironic thing about the whole thing is those places only existed because of the people in Short Creek. who were out working on jobs and sending money because these places were not self-sufficient at all. They were completely funded by the donations of members of the church that were not there.
Oh,
That's the
wow.
only way they existed, and that's millions and millions of dollars.
Holy cow. So not only is not only are they being looked down upon by leadership and probably others that were there, right? And I'm not casting judgment on those members who were in those other lands, so to speak, there in Texas and Colorado and South Dakota. But because they don't know any different, right? They're just doing what they've been told. But so not only are the people back in Short Creek being looked down upon, but they're the ones funding the whole process.
That's correct.
Oh, the irony. Um, okay, so when the raids happen, what's your response? What do you do? Is everybody pretty compliant? I mean, with the law enforcement that's coming in, what's the general feel there of everyone else? I mean, is it just pandemonium? What happens as they come in?
So we cooperated with the officers once they show the search warrant. And they first came on, CPS came and started interviewing the teenage girls. They didn't search anything right away. And I don't know what the original warrants were. I know that they obtained additional warrants while they were there. And the second day, they started to remove first some of the girls, and then they came to our house and they took all the children, including me. I was 17 at the time. And eventually they removed all the children off the land and a lot of the mothers, because the mothers wanted to stay with their children. They took us to El Dorado, which is the town right there. And then they moved us up to San Angelo, which is a city that's about 50 miles north
Mm-hmm.
of that land. And from there, they separated the children from the mothers and moved the children to a lot of different locations across the state of Texas. So we were really scattered everywhere. And I went to Boys Ranch up in the panhandle of Texas with 72 other boys.
Jeez. Your head must have been spinning at that.
Yeah, I was the oldest boy that was taken. And I basically was in charge of these 72 boys until June. So the raid started in early April, ended. We went back home at 2nd of June about.
So about
So that was a huge responsibility. I can't tell you how big that was to have that many boys under my watch care.
Oh man. So what as you're trying to care for these boys in this boys' home, and these are all boys you know from the communities, right?
Yes.
How are they dealing with stuff? Are they all pretty shocked and broken up? I mean, what's happening there?
Yes, the children were really traumatized. First
Gotcha.
of all, thinking the world is out to destroy us and being separated from their parents, taken to a foreign place. And we were angry. We felt like they were trying to destroy us. And this was proof because they took us all from our parents.
Yeah.
So that confirmed everything to us. And I think perhaps that's the biggest mistake Texas made, was to take all the children from their parents and do that instead
Right.
of get right to the bottom of the actual criminal activity that was going on.
No, I remember watching the raids and really feeling like, the ball was being dropped here a little bit when it came to separating children from their parents, right? I
Mm-hmm.
try to be generous in terms of, well, that maybe they didn't know what they were dealing with at the time, but that wouldn't have taken long to sort out, I wouldn't think, right? Not everybody
Right.
on those lands were criminally involved with Warren Jeffs, right? Um, and
Right.
so it was, I remember being a little bit perturbed by that myself, seeing that. What would you do to kind of keep everybody together, so to speak? 72 boys, dude, and you're 17?
Yeah, so we had two houses. They each had 5 rooms. So we had about 6 to 8 boys per room. And I just gave the older boys a responsibility over a certain amount of younger boys to take care of, to do their laundry, make sure they had everything they needed. And that's kind of how we spend our days. The staff up there had activities for us and everything too. And then there was lawyer visits, CASA visits, CPS visits. So that stuff kept us really occupied, and a lot of turmoil for sure.
Gotcha. Whew, good on you, man. Holy cow. 72 young boys that you kind of felt the responsibility for since you were the oldest. So now
Mm-hmm.
was was at what point do you remember, was there ever a point at which you were thinking, okay, maybe these people who took us weren't such bad people? I mean, was there ever a sense of that, or through this whole experience were you just like, these guys are the enemy, they're here to destroy us? I mean, at what point was there ever a point at which you were like, okay, maybe there was something wrong with where I grew up?
So once we got to Boys Ranch, we did form a friendship with some of the people there that were quite kind and outgoing and looked out for us. So I think the main impression that we did get from going out like that was that the people out there weren't as bad and mean as we thought they were. I don't think we had association with them long enough to realize there's actually good people out here that are
Gotcha.
happy and all that. So we had implanted in us pretty strongly that nobody else is happy out in this world besides us. We're the only happy people there are. Everyone else is sad, and they might have a false happiness, but we're the only happy people.
Gotcha. Whew, man. Okay. So at some point you're returned back to the ranch, right? Do you ever get to go back to the ranch, or what happens?
Yeah, so we moved back there. Pretty much all of us were back there by within a year of being taken off. So the children got to go back to their mothers after about 2 months. But a lot of the mothers had moved to rental homes in their effort to get their children back. And it was a process of getting the cases closed and all that before everyone moved back there. And then we didn't really have a lot going on in terms of projects until late 2010. And that's when my father kind of picked it up again from jail and started directing more projects to be built, started sending people away that he didn't feel like were worthy to be there. And an uptick in activity started again.
Gotcha. When you said your father would send people away that he deemed as dangerous or whatever, what kind of people would he typically send away? I mean, what would be the common infraction that would get you moved out of that community, kicked out?
Um, if you were in Texas or on one of those lands he had established, then all it took was him to have supposedly God tell him that you shouldn't be there, and he'd send you back to Short Creek. That the main people that actually got sent out of the community were in Short Creek. Once in a while, it would happen in Texas, but most of the time from Short Creek. And it didn't have to be an obvious thing. It could just be him claiming that he had a revelation that somebody should be sent away to repent because they were supposedly guilty of something. And often you find out they actually hadn't done anything that he had accused them of. So that's a really hard one because people would get sent away without actually being guilty of the crime he accused them of. But there was no way for anybody else to stand up and say, no, they didn't do that, because that would just get them sent away. And it's really hard to explain that to people that didn't live in it. But if you're considering him as someone that can basically give you or deny you your salvation, and you believe in it, and you've been raised your whole life to believe that he's the prophet because his father was the prophet, and the line all the way back to Joseph Smith, and you're taught, if you don't obey what he says, your salvation will be lost eternally. And so it really is a fear-based obedience and a fear-based culture off of doing what he says, or else you're out.
Hmm. You know, it's interesting to me as you're describing that very scenario. Um, and if you feel I'm wrong here in any way, Ammon, you feel free to push back against anything I say, please. Um, but it reminds me of I remember I read a book about a woman who escaped North Korea. But it was kind of the same thing, right? She talks about how she had friends whose parents had questioned the leader, and then um they would just kind of disappear in the night, right? Now, to my knowledge, Warren wasn't killing anyone. He was just telling them leave the creek, right? Or leave Texas or whatever. But it's still kind of the same principle, right? You're just getting rid of people. And the idea is if you stick up for them, well, you're next. You're the next one to leave. Um, and I find that to be somewhat worrisome. Is that a fair comparison at all?
Yes, and especially for a man to be sent away, then he lost his family, he lost his wives and children. And before my father got taken to prison, they would be given to other men quite quickly. So he really didn't have hope of getting him back. And you say like North Korea, and I will say it's also echoes from Nazi Germany and communism. And I would say that, especially as he tried to establish what he called the United Order, it really took on a form of religious communism more than anything else,
Interesting.
where the punishment, because they're not going to come in and kill you, right?
Right.
But to send you out, to send you away, to take away your membership, you lose all the blessings and privileges of your community, and it's held over you. You know, you could repent and come back and get your blessings. So don't do anything to bring any more disfavor in case you get to come back. So your salvation's being held over your head constantly as a punishment, and then losing all your blessings as a punishment, your associations. Generally, when someone's sent completely away from the community, their communication was completely cut off from any family or friends, and they're just on their own out in the world.
And they're not equipped for that, right? I mean, well, I'm guessing, and correct me again, correct me if I'm wrong here. There's probably not a lot of life skills that a lot of these people being sent away would have, right? They don't know how to, I don't know, go get an apartment or, go looking for a job, right? Because most of the jobs were assigned within the communities. Is that correct?
Right. So if someone was sent away, they, especially the younger they were, then they weren't socially ready for the world.
Right.
They knew how to work hard. And generally, people were told by the bishop where to work before this, what company, church owned, or members of the church owned the companies. So it's a huge leap into the dark to be sent away.
Did you ever experience anyone getting sent away that really perplexed you, right? Really made you scratch your head at that point and was like, is this really something that should have happened?
So the first person that I felt like I was close to that got sent away was actually Merrill Jessup, who was in the first presidency with my father. And from the time I was 14 down in Texas till he got sent away when I was 20, he'd been way more my father than father was. And I'd become quite close with him. He taught me the things that a father teaches his teenage son, and the responsibility, the work ethic, and even the trades I learned was more him guiding me onto different crews and helping me learn. So I had and still have a ton of respect for him. And I was very shocked when he got sent away. Couldn't understand why. But, you can't question or else it's you next.
Right, right. Yeah, no, these are only things that are safe to ask to yourself. right? Quietly, without anybody
Right.
else knowing. Whew. Did you ever find out why that gentleman got sent away?
I don't know why he got sent away.
Okay. Man, that is rough. So we kind of stop there at the raids. What happens after you get back and the uptick in activity starts again?
We built a massive house that was supposed to be Father's home when he got out of prison. And so in the FLDS, the people have been taught, and it's almost part of their religion now, to pray for the prophet's deliverance. Constantly sent in revelations from prison that he's just about to be delivered. The people just need to be more faithful, more one. He'll be delivered. So we had us build a house, and I'm trying to remember how big it was. It was in the range of about 75,000 square feet for him. So we were supposed to be done in about 3 months, and we ended up taking 7 or something like that. But he sent a lot of people away from the land at the same time. And he had made me principal of the school there that year. So we had about 300 students. And by the time the school year was up in May of 2011, we had about 100. And that's a pretty good ratio of adults that got sent away too. So our workforce dropped dramatically through those months, even though our time schedules were so tight. And fast forward to 2012, he required the whole church, the FLDS in Short Creek, anywhere they were, that they had to be rebaptized. He had them baptized into the United Order, and that's how they joined it.
Right.
And if they weren't, they were not part of the church anymore. And they had to go through a bishop interview. If they didn't pass, they weren't allowed to be part of the church anymore. So that was a huge, I'll say, huge change for the whole church. The whole FLDS group was the first of 2012.
Ooh. Holy cow. So you're made principal of a school while still trying to work on your father's house.
Yes.
Wow. And okay, so at this point, as the principal of the school, did you have any idea what you were doing? Did anyone break you in and like, hey, this is what we're doing? Like, hey, here's your office. Good luck, son.
I I was an assistant with the 7th and 8th grade boys the year before.
Okay.
And then the next school year that started, he put me right into teaching devotional every morning, kind of like seminary, I guess.
Right.
And then put me over the school. Yeah, it was a brand new experience.
Holy cow. Ooh. Man, that is a lot to go through. Now, in 2012, was your father in prison at that time, or was he still on the run?
Yeah, so he got caught by the law in 2006, August 28, 2006.
Okay.
And he was convicted in Texas in August of 2011. And that's when he got his life sentence plus 20 years.
What was that like when that sentencing came down? Well,
It was
first,
a little bit of,
but before we
go
go there,
ahead.
let me ask this question. Through this time of your father being in jail, right? Not prison, but jail, and he's going through the court system, right? Going through the judicial process here. Are you guys made aware at all of the charges that are brought against him?
No. And originally, he was being hunted down. We called up over an underage marriage in the Short Creek time when his father was the prophet, and it was the Elisa Wall case. So that went through the Utah courts. He was convicted, and then he was moved to Arizona to go through another case there. Meanwhile, the Utah case was overturned, and then the Arizona case kind of fell apart. But at that point, the Texas case was going, and he was indicted. So he was moved to Texas. So he moved, went to Utah to prison, Then he went to Arizona. Then he went back to Utah, from Utah to Texas.
Wow. And this whole time, you're not hearing a word about what he's actually being charged with.
So we knew that it had something to do with Elisa while being married young. At least the adults knew that. But in Texas, when he got wind that the Texas state had got a hold of his records, his private personal records that he had been keeping, he sent a message to the whole people to, if they touched any of his records, they would forever lose their place in the church. And they could not be used on the mission of Zion or in any capacity and would just have to be sent away. And within a month or two of that, he also gave them a commandment they couldn't touch the internet at all, or they would be sent away forever.
I see.
And that's how he's covered up from them what he's done to this day. And he also says to the people, there's sacred teachings in those records that I haven't been authorized to give to you yet. And if you touch them without my permission or God's permission, then you're lost forever. Your salvation is gone. So it's a fear-based thing to keep the people from asking any questions of why things are the way they are. So most of the people don't even know exactly why he's in prison. And that also is why they don't know the abuse he's done to his own daughters, especially, and sisters, because there's a wall protecting them, a psychological wall protecting them from that information. If someone leaves the group, say a couple of his daughters that have, and tell the stories about what he did to them as children, the pedophilia he's guilty of, that can't get back to the FLDS, because if they left, they're an apostate. Apostates tell lies. And if you listen to what the apostates say, then you'll be darkened and fall away and lose your salvation forever. So it's very difficult to try to get any information back to the people about the reason things are the way they are for them.
Gotcha. True. So when the
and we should add,
go ahead, sorry, Ammon.
one more thing to throw in. I mentioned January 1st, 2012 being a big day, big change. At that time, he also said no one could have any children or any marital relations until he comes out of prison, and teaches them the proper way to do that. And people don't understand what he means. They think it just means temple ordinances. Anybody that's spent time in his records and knows the things he's been teaching to a select few knows exactly what he means when he says that. And it's too dark of a subject to even really talk about on here, the details of it.
Okay.
Just very morally depraved things.
Oh. So he basically says no marital relations, right? So, I imagine the birth rate fell, right?
Zero.
Yeah, to zero. That's got to put strains on families. I mean, at this point, if you're not on the inside and you haven't been kept from that information, you don't know what's going on. But I suppose at some level there were some people that had to have been like, okay, this is starting to turn into, well, not starting to, we're in the middle of a horror show now, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
during this time when he's in prison, going through the legal process, does anybody feel like they can talk still, or is everyone still like, no, 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 we don't you dare question anything?
Yeah, well, it's a lot like you would find in a communist society. You might want to question something, but the person you talk to might tell on you, might snitch on you. And you
God,
find that that's really a prevalent thing in communism, right? You
right.
turn everyone against each other to where they'll snitch on each other so that people can't question what's going on, and that's how you keep control over them.
Oh man.
So, and this generation, my generation especially, has grown up with the idea that the prophet owns you, and your loyalty is to him first. So if you get married, obviously he's chosen who you should marry. Your loyalty is still to him. If you're a wife, it's to him above your husband. Or if you're the husband, it's him above your family. So if the father starts to question things, most likely the mothers or the
Right.
children will turn against the father and tell on him, and he'll get sent away. Or if the mother does, she'll get sent away and lose her children, possibly. So it's that's why it's so difficult for people to come out of that,
Absolutely.
especially as a family unit. Very, very few family units that have been able to come out as a family.
Yeah. How about you? Do you get married before any of this happen? Do you end up getting married as once you get out of foster care and that sort of thing?
So he stopped marriages when he went to prison in 2006. So he hasn't
Okay.
sanctioned any marriage since 2006. And I was 16. So no, I didn't get married, and very strongly taught doctrine in the FLDS that you can't get married unless the prophet marries you and chooses who you get married to.
Wow. So, and is it still that way today?
Yes, it is. So there's a lot of people my age, 33, 34, 35, that are still unmarried.
Wow.
And they're always being told, just wait just a little bit longer and the prophet will come, and you'll be so happy if you wait for him to tell you who you should marry.
Mm, those poor people. I'm just sitting here blown away, right? That the one of the most sacred things that the Lord has given us that brings us the most joy is marriage, monogamous or plural, right?
Right.
It's absolutely one of the most divine gifts that a loving father ever gave his children, and then to have that denied, that's harsh. Um, oh, excuse me. So you let me gather my thoughts here. I apologize. So what's it like when the sentencing comes down? When you hear that, hey, it's life in prison, is that given to anybody? Is that something that's kind of kept on the down low for as long as it can? What happens there?
So he had the man on the different places, including Short Creek, have circle prayers every 15 minutes, day and night, during his whole court trial and sentencing period. So we found out right away when that happened that it was a life sentence. But he had already sent all these revelations saying that he was going to be delivered by the hand of God, not by the government. And it would be something like Paul the Apostle or Peter or Alma and Amulek in the Book of Mormon, that type of a deliverance. And that's still what they're looking for.
Are those
And
are those prayer circles
that's
still
what the people's
happening?
faith is based on.
Yeah, are those
Those went on. Those went on until mid 2012, and they kind of fell apart because when he instituted the United Order thing, and you have to be a member of the United Order to be part of the church. It kind of started this member non-member thing,
okay.
and a lot of us, like he would say, you need to repent of something, and it could be complete fabrication of his mind, but he could send a revelation that somebody needed to repent, and they'd be made a non-member, could be sent away from where they were for a few weeks or a few months, and then he'd send them a new one that says you can be rebaptized now. So it really started a lot of disarray in the FLDS.
Oh yeah.
So there's kind of you're a member, you're a non-member thing.
So let me ask you this. In the time that he's since 2006 when he stopped all marriages, has rearranging families stopped at that point too?
The main thing that happens if a father gets sent away is they would have another man they would call a caretaker. They would have them go under his direction, and he would do their family training or whatever, but they wouldn't be given to him.
Okay.
And right now, because of the disarray that's happened in the FLDS, they're a lot more on their own than they used to be. Not so much under another person if a father or parents get sent away.
Okay. So at what point, and now I'm going to make this a little personal for you here, if it's okay, Ammon. At what point do you start questioning things now? I mean, at what point? Because it sounds like up to about what were you saying until you were about 20, you were just kind of working the program, so to speak, right? You were very much
Yes.
fully engaged and fully believing here in your father and what was happening, or and your perception that was given to you of what was happening. At what point do you start to question things yourself?
So the first time I felt a question would have been first of 2012 when he sent me away from Texas to South Dakota, which would be considered a downgrade back then.
Okay.
And he was supposed to have another person ask me if he was sending away a large group of his family for messing up the flowers in the property.
Oh,
And I wasn't part of it. But in the same message, he told one of the people that he would send his revelations to be typed up to ask me if I wanted to go or stay. And I didn't want to go. So I said I'd stay. And then he had him read me an answer that said, the Lord revealed to me you'd want to stay. And that's proof of your pride and whatever. So you have to be sent away now. And then at the end of the message they were reading to me, it said, and even if he says he'll go, then you still need to read this to him because he still needs to repent. So I was listening to that and I'm like, so it doesn't really matter what I chose. You're claiming to read my mind. And what couldn't you accuse me of at this point? That's when I felt like I started to question. And I had a lot of whiplash for the next, 5 or 6 years of this kind of thing going on with me. And fast forward to middle of 2012, he sent another revelation claiming that I had molested my sisters, which blew me out of the water. And over the next few years, he would do this to me, send a revelation claiming I hadn't confessed to him, doing these different things. And I couldn't understand why. And I didn't understand why until 2023 when I found out what he had done to my sisters, that he was just projecting his sins onto me, trying to get me to say I was guilty of them.
holy cow. Well, and that was, look, I've talked to people who don't want to go on the record, and I can't blame them, right? You're a brave man, Ammon, because I'm not sure I'd want to go through this again. But that was the thing that popped out to me most, is that it was almost like he would at any given moment just focus on somebody and kind of play mind games, right? I don't know how else to explain it.
Correct.
Almost like almost like he was trying to break them mentally and spiritually so that they would become completely 100% reliant upon him. Is that a fair assessment on my part, or am I off base on that?
Yeah, 100%. And you have to realize he's sending this as the direct word of God.
Right.
It's supposedly not him. This is God accusing you basically of sin.
Right. And per your last statement about how he said he was suffering as Christ suffered for the people, he's almost a step above just the prophet at this point, right? He has now
Right.
elevated himself up into a messianic figure, which carries even more weight than just a typical one man prophet, right?
Right. And we'll get to that deeper into it towards the end here.
Yeah. Okay, so it comes down that hey, he's going to be in jail for the rest of his life potentially. What happens after that?
So he really got the United Order effort going in Short Creek. He'd already had it on the other places from the time he established them, but the place is kind of emptied out once Texas got taken by the Texas government, and the main effort was there in Short Creek. He had his family in other places and in South Dakota, but not really other people. So the effort of the group was centered in Short Creek again. And the problem there was he kept making people that were part of the order non-members, and the United Order, even in Short Creek, lived off of non-member contributions for 90% of its functionability, the storehouse and all that. And the people were trying to live out of this storehouse. And I'll say, in my opinion, it was set up very wrong from the way God means for the United Order to operate, the law of consecration. And the people became more and more poor, especially just the normal lay members of the church didn't have a whole lot because you couldn't get anything unless you put a request into the storehouse, and then people working at the storehouse were supposed to purchase, get your food supplied to you and everything. And people's needs just weren't met. The food they got was generally a poorer quality nutrition and all that. And that's really how the people lived until about 2016. And in 2016, I'd been in Short Creek because he had made me a non-member. I wouldn't confess to him to things I hadn't done, so he wouldn't let me be a member. And he sent me away, far away, like other men, for about 9 months. And right after he sent me away, he made everyone in Short Creek non-members and said nobody held the priesthood but himself. And that really started the breakup of their United Order effort. And people over the next 6 months went out and got jobs. And a lot of people moved out of Short Creek to Cedar City and other cities up along the I-15 corridor, mostly in southern Utah, though, which is where they are still. And for the most part, most of them have jobs. Most of them aren't part of a United Order or anything like that.
Holy cow. And so when he sent you away, far away, if you don't mind me asking, where'd he send you?
He just told me to go to the north central states, don't go east of the Mississippi. So I went to Minnesota. This was when Lyle Jeffs was still there. So he's the one that told me I was supposed to go. He took all my phone, took any phones I had. So I couldn't communicate with anybody. And I went north end of Minnesota and worked up there for 9 months. And I didn't associate with a single soul that I knew that whole time.
So you went out and found a job on your own and just had to reestablish everything on your own?
Yes, I did.
What was that like for you?
It's really rough and really emotional at first, but felt like I got to know some good people out there, have some really good friends that I still have till today that I worked for and worked with. And I discovered there was good people out there, really honest, God-fearing Christians. But in 2017, he called me back with a lot of other people he had sent away. And I'll say around this time is when I feel like he really started getting a case of schizophrenia, where his mind started to go away and he lives outside reality. But he had these meetings start again in Short Creek, but only people he named could go there. And so for a few months, I got to go with a lot of others. And towards the end, all that we would hear in those meetings were revelations that he wrote from prison or had recorded and sent there. and they got to be really out of reality. So he would claim that, a third of the population had been taken off the earth and put on some other planet, taken in death because they were so wicked. And he said a lot of times that certain judgments of God would come upon this nation, which came and went, nothing happened. And as he started saying those things, then I was to the point where I didn't believe that kind of stuff when he would say it. Part of it goes back to 2007. In January of 2007, he called our house in Texas, and this is when I was 16, and he said he wasn't the prophet anymore. And he privately called several individuals and told them that he had been immoral to a daughter and a sister. We didn't know that was why he was saying he wasn't the prophet. And he told them he didn't hold the priesthood. He said he hadn't held it since he was 20 years old. But the message I heard when he called, he just said, I'm the wickedest man that's ever lived. I'm not the prophet. Well, the men in charge came in and talked to us and told us they felt like he wasn't in his right mind. And he was just saying things because he was under so much pressure in jail. And I got the idea from these men, including Uncle Merrill, Jessup, and my Uncle Isaac, who told me that he wasn't in his right mind. It gave me the impression that I could ask questions. And if I felt like the prophet was saying things that were off, I could, at least for myself, try to go square it with scripture or with what the prophet Joseph said. And that's where I got the idea that even a prophet might get off his rocker once in a while.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't mean to giggle at all, but it's just when you're raised in that sort of environment, it's got to be the most foreign thought in the world to you that hey, maybe he is mortal, right? Maybe he does have, a few, have some things wrong here, obviously. But I do remember here watching a clip of him when he was standing in prison, and he basically says that, right? They have the audio of
Yes.
him saying that very thing. And it's interesting that it's not just because I always thought until you just told me, I always thought that was maybe a one-time deal, right? But it sounds like he actually made phone calls to certain people, you being one of them, and saying, "Hey, yeah, no, I'm not a prophet. I'm a wicked guy." What do you knowing your father, right, as much or as little as you do you think that was a moment of clarity for him? Do you think he really lost his mind? What were you thinking on that at that point?
So my initial reaction, well, I was totally shocked. So the message or what the phone call I heard was broadcast over the intercom to our whole family. So the whole family heard it all at once when he said it, but he called others individually and told them more. So we didn't understand why he was saying it. The other people he called, today I feel like they should have gone and questioned some people down and said, did this kind of stuff happen to you as a child, like he's saying? Instead, they all decided that he was just out of his mind. So at first I believed him when he first said he wasn't the prophet, just for a couple of hours until we got told that, hey, he's out of his mind, because I was conditioned to believe everything he said. Like from my youth, and especially once he was named as the prophet to everyone, then if he said something you could consider it scripture, that was the mentality and is the mentality still in that group.
Gotcha.
So it was a relief to us. It was a relief to us to be like, oh, he's just not in his mind right now because he's under so much pressure.
Whew. And then do you remember did when does he kind of recant that? Does he ever address that later and said, "Oh, never mind, it was just a test."
Yeah, so he didn't call for a couple of weeks, and then he calls back and says, yeah, I'm still the prophet. And God's told me to continue in my position and continue to tell the people what to do and guide them. And then he went quiet. He went quiet for months. And I think the people in charge knew he wasn't still in his mind. And I guess he tried saying a few more times that he wasn't the prophet after that. But we didn't hear it. We didn't see it. That's where you get the thing that says he tried to resign as president of the church and all that. It really went on for a period of months. And he came out of it in April of 2007.
Gotcha. Okay. So all of this happens. Now, I want to get in what happens to you from that point, right? When you start hearing all this, and so now this is introducing into your mind a lot of questions, right? Like, hey, he doesn't necessarily always believe he's a prophet. And so when you come and let me see if I can remember this correctly. You went back to Short Creek. That's where he makes those phone calls about he's not the prophet, or was that earlier?
That was in Texas in 2007.
Okay,
And
that was
I wasn't in Short Creek very much until 2014. And then, I'd go somewhere else and then he'd send me back there 2015, 2016. Then he sent me away in 2016 and let me come back in 2017 to those meetings he started in Short Creek. And that's when the things he said started getting really wild and inconsistent. So at the same time, I started living in northern Utah with some of my cousins, and we started working on construction and all that. But we were going to these meetings, and then suddenly he cut us off from the meetings. And it was when he was sending revelations to be printed to send to all the leaders of the nations and everything that were really bizarre. So personally, I wrote him off. Like, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to forget about it. I didn't really say that to anybody because that can get you out, right?
right.
But he started the meetings again with just a few select people. And a lot of the people he selected were young people, younger than me, like 15, 16, 17, 18, 20-year-olds, and a few adults. And when they'd come back from these, they wouldn't talk to us anymore and treat us really strange. And it went on for a few months, and then their meetings stopped. And the people that went to those meetings treated a lot of us really strange for about a year. They'd never tell us what they heard. One thing in all these meetings is you had to promise you would never talk about what he said.
Oh,
which is also another tactic to
yep.
keep the people from getting together and reasoning things out, right? You can't even talk with each other for the most part about what he's telling you. Anyway, fast forward, I got to work and I made a commitment in my mind, end of 2017, that I was done being afraid of him. And I was just going to worry about earning money and living my life. And hopefully he came back to his sanity and started talking again. So up to this point, obviously, I didn't know he had committed any great crimes against my own siblings and other people. I didn't realize that had gone on. So in my mind, I still think he's an innocent person, but he's been persecuted and he's in prison. That fast forward to 2021. So I'm 31 now. And I have 7 of my sisters suddenly leave the FLDS group. And these sisters were the sisters that he was calling and talking to still all this time. And I wasn't hearing anything, so I was shocked and was like, what's going on? And I started to question family members that knew what was going on. And they started telling me about the revelations he was giving them, which were it's so bizarre that you have to read them to realize how crazy it is. The claims he makes. He claims world events are happening. The judgments of God have come and gone. And horrific things, that accusations that he levels at many members of the church. Anyway, so I found that out, and I was like, yeah, obviously he's not in his mind. And if we're going to follow any correct principle, then we have to write off everything he's saying and not listen to any of it and just go back to our scriptures. And I started talking like that to members of my family that I felt like I could say it to. Some agreed, some didn't agree. Anyway, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them.
No, I'm just listening. I'm fascinated here.
Okay. The next year in 2022, my younger brother, Helaman, he's kind of well known now, so not afraid to say his name. He has been there with the people that Father uses, Father calls and talks to. And he told me that he had information that people in prison were trying to give my father drugs to make him be crazy. And I knew that he wouldn't do anything about it. And the other members of the family wouldn't do anything about it because they were so afraid that if they did something, Father would call and send them away and rebuke them severely. Anyway, so I wrote a letter to the governor of Texas, to his office, saying, hey, I understand that people are saying this, somehow Father's being given drugs to make him go crazy. And he's calling his family and giving them crazy messages. And they're so afraid of him that they think somehow it's true, even though it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I sent that off and I didn't think I'd get an answer back. But a few weeks later, then my father calls his family and says that I'm accusing him of being on drugs. And so he has him send me a message and he says, you know, it's the most terrible thing you ever could have done to accuse me of being on drugs. And this is apostasy. And then he turned it around and said, you're the person that's on drugs. You're the person guilty of sin. You've been with prostitutes. You've been out committing adultery, doing all sorts of terrible immoralities. And even went on to say I'd killed hundreds of people. And then in the end of the message, he said, if you'll confess to all this, then you'll get to have a family and be restored and have your membership in the church. Otherwise, I'm not going to talk to you again. Anyway, so I heard that and I was like, okay, that didn't work. And I sent him a letter and I said, Father, you know, I'm just going to let you know I forgive you for what you accused me of. And when we meet at the bar of God, I'll be able to look you in the eye and tell you I didn't do this. And he called back and told the family that I was accusing him of lying and told him I was going to call him before the bar of God. And so at that point, I was like, okay, I'll be better off to just not write anything. I'm going to worry about my work and forget about all this. And by now I was living in Western Wyoming on the Idaho border, pretty much.
Okay.
Up there, Star Valley, about an hour south of Jackson.
You know exactly where you're at. Yep.
And yeah, so a couple days later, he sends another message to me and another brother and tells us that we're sent away and we should go far east and have no communication whatsoever with anyone in the FLDS group. And I told the message bearer that thanks, but I'm probably not going to do anything. I'm just going to stay where I am. And they sent the message again a couple days later. And I said, I'm only going back east if it's a holiday for a vacation, but I'm just not going anywhere. This is getting kind of silly.
Good for you. Good for you.
So about that point, you know, I just started minding my own business and working. And fast forward to 2023 in May, my father still claimed these sisters that had left were faithful. And also, some of his children that had left years ago, he suddenly claimed they were these righteous, faithful people. He claimed they were in the celestial kingdom, exalted to godhood. And so some of the family would visit them and talk to them. And I had a younger sister that went and visited some of my sisters that had left and got married. And she decided she wanted to stay with this sister because she was about to have a baby. And he had taught us that was like the worst thing you could do, go to apostates and be with them. So this younger sister, I was like, why are you staying with the apostates? Father told us that's something that'll help us lose our faith. And the next day, my older sister told me that she was terrified that this younger sister was going to hear things that would make her leave the church. And she sent this younger sister a text message, and she copied me on it. So I got the same text message. And in it, she said that there's things you're going to hear if you're not careful about Father that would make you leave work. And it would even make his wives leave. And I have a personal experience, so I know what I'm talking about. So I had called this older sister of mine and said, what on earth are you talking about? Is this the things that he's always telling us we can't hear that are in the sacred records? And she said, no. It's like, okay, then is it something that happened to you? And she finally admitted to me that he had molested her when she was a child. And that's the thing that blew me out of the water. I was so unprepared to hear that and so shocked. And it took me about 2 weeks to really get that into my head that this really happened. He really did this. And he did it to several of my sisters. And I started asking questions of her. I started talking to my sisters that had left, and that's the reason they left, and dug this out, that he had this major problem, pedophilia problem, of molesting young girls. And I knew darn good and well that a prophet is not a pedophile.
Right.
And so he couldn't claim the authority he claimed and be doing those type of things. And that's where I stepped out and really started investigating what's going on. How did we get here? And if this is the true church, why did God allow this to happen to it? And that's where I really started asking questions, because that's about as major of a faith crisis as you can come to.
Oh, yeah.
And something you believed in so strongly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So everything's kind of set on the table now, right? You you're kind of seeing, and again, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding here, but it seems like there's been a slow buildup, right? Where you start thinking, okay, something's not quite right here, and then he kind of tries to play some of these mind games with you, Ammon, and you're just like, you're kind of going with it for a while. You go to Minnesota, and then finally they try to send you away back east again. You're like, you know what? I'm good, but thanks for the offer, sort of a thing, right? And
Right.
you kind of stand your ground. And then after you talk to your sisters, you start seeing everything laid before you, right? That is actual truth, right? And there's no denying it now. They weren't just empty allegations. This was coming from your family, and everything's starting to fall into place and make sense. Where does that
Exactly.
put you with the gospel overall? Do you have a moment then where you're like, is any of this true?
So as a young person, I grew up reading a lot, and I read the journals a lot. I read the first 21 volumes of the Journals of Discourses by the time I was 18.
Hmm.
And I felt like that really helped to ground the gospel into me, give me a testimony of the prophet Joseph.
Hmm.
And I had, as a young person, gone and read about the doctrine of plural marriage because I wanted to understand why we live it. And, in our family, it was really messed up because my father had taken so many women. I mean, he had 78 at that point, and he didn't have a proper marital loving relationship with these ladies. A lot of them, I saw them just toil day and night to keep the family going. Most of them never had any children. And then there were always the few special ones. And I didn't feel like that was right. So I went and read what Brigham Young, Orson Pratt, and those men taught. And then I would read any family experiences I could find where children or wives wrote their stories of what happened. And I felt quite grounded in that and grounded in my testimony of the prophet Joseph. So when I learned everything that my father was guilty of, the first question that came to my mind is, where did we go wrong in this fundamentalist movement?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'd been taught about the 1886 revelation.
Sure.
And this is where we get into the doctrine. So in the FLDS, you read the story about the 1886 revelation, and it's presented as John Taylor got this revelation for the continuance of plural marriage, and he set up an order for it to continue.
Mm-hmm.
And, all fundamentalists believe that. But where it starts to go different in the FLDS is at that time, he appointed John Woolley to be the next prophet. And then John Woolley appointed his son Lauren to be the next prophet. Lauren appointed John Y. Bartle to be the prophet after him. John Y. Bartle appointed Leroy Johnson. Leroy Johnson appointed Ammon Jeffs. Ammon Jeffs appointed Warren Jeffs. And that's what they're taught. So my first question is, where did this line go wrong? So I first went back to my grandfather, and in trying to understand how my father could do what he did and get away with it, I learned that he had also harmed his own sisters and that his father knew it and did nothing about it and actually continued to promote him and to give him more wives. So I said, okay, if my grandfather's promoting that kind of stuff, that's not what a prophet does. He doesn't promote this kind of wickedness. And I worked my way all the way back to the Woolies and started listening to the podcasts on here, and very much enjoyed the John W. Taylor podcast you did with Michael Ness.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Those are very helpful because in the FLDS, pretty much we're told there's not really any history from that time. So this is what happened. And I come to find out in my opinion, those woolly men didn't consider themselves the prophet. They didn't consider themselves this one man that was standing in Joseph Smith's shoes. And therefore, the line's broken that they're following and claiming is their one true line. And I realize that in fundamentalism, the biggest conflicts come from claims of authority.
Yeah.
Between the groups. But that's where their one man line is that I just named to you. And if there's a break in that, none of that makes sense, what they're propagating.
So does the FLDS just kind of like skim over Joseph Musser?
My grandfather made a statement that all the apostasies from John Y. Bartle till the split in 1978 are Joseph Musser's fault. So he's looked on as the bad guy. So if anybody in the FLDS right now thinks Joseph Musser's a really bad guy.
Ooh, that's interesting. It's almost like when the FLDS Church really becomes of age, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm making an educated guess or just kind of, trying to read the forest from the trees here a little bit. But it almost seems like from the very beginning, there seems to be a bit of isolationism built into it, right? Not recognizing certain guys, glossing over some history, and just kind of deep sixing some information from its members to bolster their leadership's authority claims. Is that a fair assessment, Ammon?
Yeah, very much so. Until today, then you shouldn't even be reading any books that my father doesn't approve of, which isolate you further. So I'll say this kind of talk really started around 1984 and grew as my grandfather took the leadership, and to the 10th power when my father took over. And my generation, and perhaps part of the generation older than me, don't really understand anything that went on with very much depth. And so the doctrine makes sense to them because that's all they've heard.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And I know it's hard to understand the weight the prophet carries among that people.
No, I don't think it.
So
Yeah, no, I can see how people can get there, right? Because I think we even have to back up further, right? And I've said this before, and I truly mean this, that that 99.9% of the blame, or maybe just we'll just say 95% of the blame, is on the leadership that within the FLDS Church that either perpetrated or went along with this. However, none of these things that happened down there in Texas and Short Creek and anywhere else where these atrocities were committed, those can't happen unless the 1940s and the 1950 raids happen, right? Because what that does is that forces a people into the shadows, right? And when you have a people
correct.
who have been beat up, have to worry about their kids being taken away, you force them into the shadows. That gives people with ill intent the opportunity to come along and say, "See, I told you they're out to get you." Right? You got to listen to me. I'm the one that's going to keep you safe. You just put all your faith in me, and I'll make sure these things never happen to you again. Right? So the only way that this is truly possible to happen is if you set the table first, and you set the table by forcing a people into the shadows, and only nastiness happens within the shadows, right? um, Nothing good happens there. And so those raids and the people who perpetrated those raids, I shouldn't say people, but the entities that perpetrated those raids were the governments of Arizona, Utah, and quite frankly, the LDS Church, right? We know that they did have a hand in this. And I do believe that in some ways they helped set the table for some of these other men to essentially be able to enslave a lot of people.
Correct. And the 1953 raids is a huge catalyst for it, really, because that's what I remember hearing about over and over as I grew up. And that's why we were so isolated from the world. We wouldn't talk to people out in the world. We wouldn't talk to a news person or anything because they were just out to get us. And that set the stage for a man to have a lot more power over the people. And then you have the contention that came up in the 1980s about the one man doctrine. And the group basically splits in half. The group that went with the one man doctrine now teaches very strongly your subservience to this one man and whatever he says, that he's your connection to God. And whatever he says goes. He can tell you what to do, he can tell you who to marry. And I know the placement marriage kind of started in the late 40s, but it was a slow build up, and it slowly built up through the years till you get to the 80s, and it was pretty cemented by then. So by 1990, no one got married unless the prophet married them. And that also gave him the power to take them away. And if you can control all the women and you can control the money that the people donate, you control the man. And if the leader can take your wives and children away from you, you're going to be pretty careful what you do so you don't lose them.
Yeah.
So that gave him immense power. I mentioned one thing that was off was the Adam God doctrine that was taught and is still taught. And to me, it ties in with the degree of power he has and is able to use with the people and the amount of control he has.
Wow. So explain to me your father's or the FLDS idea of the Adam God doctrine. What is it?
Okay. So let's say in around 1990, there was a sermon published that for many years I thought my grandfather had given. It was under his name. And I didn't realize till way later that a lot of it wasn't what my father put together. And it pretty much goes like this. Father Adam came as the father of our spirits. He came to this earth to start giving our spirits bodies. So Adam's the god of this earth.
Mm-hmm.
And where it starts to get mixed up is he says Jesus Christ is Jehovah, and Jehovah is the father of Michael's spirit. So he equates Jesus Christ with Jehovah, says he's Michael's father of his spirit. And when Michael came down to start the spirits on this earth, he needed someone to come and make an atonement. And the only person that could come was his father, the father of his spirit, who was Jesus Christ. And so he's saying Jesus Christ is Michael's father. And then when Jesus Christ comes, he's Michael's son. And this is the way the gods do it, is this sort of reincarnation. Anyway, so
Okay,
everyone in the FLDS,
I'm trying to
are you
wrap
mixed
my
up
mind
yet?
around it. Yeah, I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. Okay, so it's like I'm so, I'm sorry, I don't mean to make jest here. I'm just trying to figure this out. So like Jesus is his own grandpa?
Yeah,
Is that kind of what we're looking at?
exactly.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
I wanted to make sure it wasn't that simple, but apparently it was kind of that simple.
Yes. So, and the way this gets carried away is so Jesus is way above Michael in
Right.
their understanding, and he's in charge of everything. Michael's just a little bit more to the side.
Gotcha.
Anyway, the way they're able to use this now is he slowly started to teach in the 90s that every one of the prophets on this earth has already been through a mortal probation on a different earth, been resurrected, and they're back here to help Michael exalt his children. So they're reincarnated too. And what that means in the minds of the people is that my father is already a god. Before he ever came here, he was already a god. And that makes him infallible.
Yeah.
And that can help you understand why he has the power he does over their minds, because they're thinking, well, this man's already a god. Maybe he's been a god on several earths before this, and we better just listen up. And if anybody says something against him, they're just fighting against him being a god.
A
So
god. Whoa. Dude, that's nuts. Okay, so like the pharaohs in Egypt would be proud of that stance. Like they taught something kind of similar, right? They were God incarnate on the earth.
right.
Oh man. Okay, so at any point does your father ever acknowledge that? Does he ever try to say, I am this guy from this time or anything
Yeah.
like that?
Yeah. In 2011, he told us that his god name was Eloi Helga. Anyway, that's the first time I heard him admit it. And now he claims that he's been part of Godhead on other earths. And he's to the point now where he'll say he's receiving word direct from Elohim and not Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ doesn't quite understand all that's going on. And he's, in a way, set himself above him.
So
And I'll
he's
say
even set himself above Jesus Christ.
today, but at the
Wow.
same time, he's quite schizophrenic too. So he's
Sure.
totally removed from reality.
Sure.
So I'll give him that little bit of room. But
Wow. Well, and see,
in
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Ammon.
in trying to sort this out as I left, this Adam God doctrine, because that's a huge thing you got to put away,
Right.
is he's not a God. Gods don't hurt little children. Anyway, I was talking about this with one of my friends that wasn't in the FLDS, and it kind of dawned on me, if Jesus Christ was the father of Michael's spirit and had to be born as Michael's son, that's like me saying, if I attain to godhood like Father Michael, that I would have to be his father on another earth, and that's just blasphemous
Right.
to even think about that.
Right. It's funny. People get upset with the Adam God doctrine as taught by Joseph and Brigham as being blasphemous, right? And I'm like, oh, bro, you don't even know, right? Like, there's
Yes.
another interpretation of this that will, yeah. Um, wow. And this is one of those things that Ammon I think is so important to understand, right? Is that I am for people believing whatever it is they want, right? As long as they don't infringe upon the rights of another, right? Is kind of the way I
Correct.
look at it, right? I'm very libertarian in that stance. I'm a guy who believes that the solution to bad ideas, whether that's religious or political or whatever, isn't to suppress the bad idea, but to counter it with a better idea, right? But
Correct.
that said, doctrine can have consequences, right? And so if a doctrine's espoused that turns a mortal man into a god in this moment, right? In this time, there are issues with that we need to be very careful about, right? Now, look, I know a ton of guys who claim to be the one mighty and strong, and a lot of them are really harmless, right? But there's a few that I'm like, bro, and that's just the one mighty and strong. That's not saying that you're already a god, right? That's a different ball of wax. And so when that gets put forward that, hey, this guy who's leading us here on this earth right now is a god, how can you combat that, right? The only way would be to put forth a correct understanding of the nature of deity so that everything could get put back into its proper place, right? um Look, I'm a
Right.
guy who studied a lot of different faith traditions before I settled on Mormonism. And I remember there was a theologian, I can never remember his name, and I've tried hard to find it, but I know I read it somewhere. And he said every heresy begins with a misconception of deity, right? Now, obviously, he'd look at the Adam God doctrine and balk, right?
Right.
Even as taught by Joseph and Brigham. However, he was correct, right? If you can unseat God from his throne in your mind and replace that with anything else, you kind of have carte blanche now to do whatever it is you want within that religious framework to make it fit something of your own heart's desire rather than what God really is. And you also affect the relationship of God to his children. And I really cringe at that idea.
Right. So that was a major, major thing for me to dig into. And I think anyone coming out of that group, I'd encourage them to set their minds straight about the Adam God doctrine, study into it what Brigham and Joseph themselves taught instead of the interpretations we were given years down the road.
Yeah,
and come to that understanding, because that's a big thing in your mind to overcome.
absolutely.
And
Go
one
ahead.
thing I've recognized too is whenever someone starts to abridge people's free agency, then you may know they're in the wrong.
Yeah,
And if you're part of a movement that you cannot question, that's when you better start asking questions.
absolutely. Let me ask you this. Where did you go to get a correct understanding of the Adam God doctrine, right? Because it's one of those mysteries that while you can find allusions to it in the scripture, it doesn't necessarily always spell it out 100%. So, what kind of material, if someone was to come to you and be like, "Hey, I'm coming out of this group. What do I read in order to get a good understanding?" Where did you go? What did you read to get your mind wrapped around a proper understanding of the Adam God doctrine?
Okay, so I went back to Brigham and Young and Joseph Smith's talks, and I was going to sit down with one of my relates through the Bartle line. So I'm related through my mother. I'm a descendant of Ianthus Bartle, who's John Bartle's brother. He was associated with the Woolies and the beginning of the fundamentalist movement. And he has a lot of descendants that are fundamentalists outside of the FLDS. And I went to sit down with him and discuss this, and I pulled up a quote from Brigham Young in the journals. And Brigham Young very expressly stated in there that the Father of our spirits and the Father of the Spirit of Jesus Christ is the man who came to the Garden of Eden to start this earth and the population of the humans on it. And that was Father Michael. And that was my answer. I was quite shocked to find it put so plainly. I don't remember ever having heard that quote as I grew up, where Brigham Young expressly stated that Father Michael was the father of Jesus Christ, spirit and body. And that put to rest what my father and my grandfather had taught me.
Mm-hmm.
And and so I did a deep dive searching up anything I could from him, John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Joseph Smith, any authority in the church in those days when it was actually being taught, and read what they said about it. There's some journal references from George Buchanan. And I also came onto this podcast and listened to any episode you had done with fundamentalists on the Adam God doctrine, where they bring all those quotes in and talk about it. And that really helped me out. And I'll say several of my siblings, I have several sisters that are also married in plural marriage to other fundamentalists outside of the FLDS group,
Good for
who
them.
kind of went through a lot of this at the same time as I did.
Good for them. So once you have that put into place, a proper understanding of deity, if you will, what happens from there for you? Do you find that your spiritual life is kind of reinvigorated at that point? Do you start digging? Are there other doctrines that you start digging into to check the veracity of that were taught to you?
Yes. So, of course, you dig through the one man doctrine, the one man, and how did we think we had a line of authority that maybe we didn't have? And I really went back to the history of what happened from 1890 till the 1930s, 1940s. And you have excellent episodes on that. I have my grandfather on my mother's side. He has brothers that are still alive that I've talked to and learned some of this from. But then I'll say the podcast series you did on that, some of the best information you can find, the history of what actually went down in those days to understand why we're at where we are now. I did have the LDS Church try real hard to get me to join, but it's pretty hard to be a fundamentalist and know what you do and then go back to the church, right? Basically
Oh,
impossible for
yes.
me.
Yeah, I could tell you horror stories, my man. That's just for mine. So, should say
So,
horror stories. They were always real nice, but man, there were times Just the having to sit through some things when you know otherwise was just frustrating was all. But
Right.
yeah,
So I couldn't go to them, but I felt very good about a lot of these other fundamentalists out here, and I felt like I needed a real legitimate baptism because my father had been the one to baptize me, and then he did the member non-member thing to where baptism became pretty trite in the
right.
FLDS, and I felt like I needed something legitimate, so I got baptized again and the priesthood again, and I was very thankful and felt very uplifted when it happened. A different feeling than I had felt as a younger man when I first received those things.
Holy cow. Dude, the fact you were able to hold on to your faith speaks volumes about you, right? That you, because I wouldn't blame anybody, right? Like if someone tells me, oh, yeah, that person came out of Colorado City during the bad days and they just tossed Mormonism to the side. And I'm a pretty faithful guy, right? I believe this stuff to my core. But even I would have been like, I get it, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's tragic, but I get it, right? I'm not sure that kind of damage, that gets done to a person. I get it. I get why someone doesn't want to go back to that, right? And that's tragic. The fact that you were
Right.
able to not just hold on to what you did have, but the fact that you were brave enough to be like, okay, let's just dig in and let's find out what's really going on here. It's commendable. It really is. Where do you think that came from? Do you think that that was just early teaching and just having that firm testimony that Jesus is the Christ, there is a loving God and Heavenly Father, and that Joseph Smith was a prophet? Do you think it was just those simple, basic truths that anchored you through that time?
Yes, those are the main. And I remember in some of the hardest times when I was in the FLDS, coming to the point where I realized if nobody else cares about me, then I know one person that does, and it's Jesus Christ. And if I can feel that love from him, I can make it through whatever gets thrown at me. And then as I came to realize what had been going on, I felt grounded in the gospel, but I started searching the scriptures to understand what God said about different things and how we had gone off. Because, how do I put this? So I separated myself, stepped back, and looked at the whole thing almost third person.
Hmm.
And a huge thing you have to do, especially out of that group, is separate the gospel from Warren Jeffs. He did a pretty good job of trying to mimic Joseph Smith in the eyes of the group. And especially the younger generation has grown up listening to his voice teach the gospel. They listen to it every day. And that's almost all they've heard, way more than just digging in and reading on their own. And so their understanding of the gospel, a lot of it comes from what he's said in what we would call trainings that they've listened to, his talks. And it takes a real effort to separate the gospel from him once you've grown up like that. I mean, every day before they start their school, they listen to a devotional that he did on me, and there's thousands of phone calls from prison that are recorded that they can listen to. There's history of the priesthood that he recorded they listen to, and they can't really listen to anyone else's because no one else is approved, and they're required to listen to that. So it's kind of drilled into their heads, and it becomes very difficult to separate the gospel from him. So when you realize what he did and you don't separate the gospel from him, or don't feel like you can, it's really easy to throw everything out and just say this is all garbage.
Right.
And often they'll get to where they're like, him and Joseph Smith are, twins. They're the same thing. I came to realize quickly that he was a counterfeit of Joseph Smith. And you couldn't find two more opposite people in the world, because here you had Joseph Smith, a farmer's boy, come in with nothing and God the Father and his son give him a mission. They have him translate the Book of Mormon and start a church. And he grows a church into thousands of faithful members they're the salt of the earth. They're the best people, the cream of the crop of other churches. And he grows a church into hundreds of thousands of members with revelation and guidance and doctrine. And even to this day, the more we learn about the Bible and everything, the more we realize how inspired Joseph Smith was. Then you bring my father in. He came to a church that was about 10,000 people. And he pillaged and destroyed and broke up, tore families apart, broke everything down, and destroyed everything. So it's the absolute opposite of what Joseph did. And that's one good way to look at the difference between the two men. One built, one destroyed.
Wow.
Another thing that I came across in the Bible, so he at the time he had forbidden marriage, right? Forbidden having children. He had also started to forbid meat. And there's a quote from Paul and Timothy, I think, that says, "In the last days there shall come a man telling you to abstain from marriage and forbidding to eat meat. These beware of." And I don't know the exact quote, but that hit so spot on when I read it. I was like, oh my goodness, we're living this very thing right now.
Yeah. And that's music to a guy's ears like me who really loves to smoke brisket. I just feel like I'm right there. No, it's fascinating, right? Because Christ himself warned us about false Christs and false prophets, right? And in the story you've told here, in the account you've given, I don't want to say story, that's not the right word. In the account that you give, both of those boxes are checked, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not so much directly with Christ, but your father puts himself in that Messiah place, right? Where he's like, oh, I'm suffering for
Absolutely.
your sins, and then he goes on to say, I was already a God once, I'm a God now. I mean, he's checking all those boxes. Um, wow. Wow. What'd you discover as far as placement marriage? Did you do any history or research on that?
Yes, I read a book. I don't remember who the writer was that kind of wrote a history of it and showed how the same way it was set up made so the families could be torn apart. And I don't like placement marriage, I'll tell you that at
Sure.
all.
Sure.
I feel like it is an abridgment of free agency.
Right.
And I've seen many instances where it was pretty obvious that the marriage was not an inspired arrangement. And
Right.
and now I even know he made statements to the effect like, we'll give this man a wife to humble him, or tell this girl, we're going to marry you to this man and it's going to be a test for you. Things like that happened that don't sound at all like revelation. So I'm grateful because I got to choose my own wife and I wouldn't have it any other way.
That's awesome. That's awesome. That's awesome. And you still have a testimony of plural marriage?
Absolutely. I love the principle. I was born through it. I love my mother who was faithful in that. My father did wrong. I absolutely admit that and feel like what he did was a great stain on the principle. And he was not living the principle correctly. But I have honorable progenitors who did live it right. And I'll say David William Ward Jeffs, who was one of the men associated with Joseph Musser and other men in the early days of fundamentalism. His father, William, and William's father, Samuel, all lived plural marriage.
Right.
So I wouldn't exist without it. And I've seen it lived beautifully by families that tried to live it right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I got some more questions, but I want to make sure that is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you really want to get to or cover before I ask these questions?
Um, I think I've hit most of the nails on the head. I'm sure I'll think of a ton of things when we get done.
Well, you know
But
what? I've told everyone this, and it's true. You have once you've been on once, you got a standing invitation. All you gotta do is give me a call. You got my number now. I'll bring you right back on. I don't have a problem with that at all, Ammon. So let me ask a couple of questions here because I feel like that this is important for us as fundamentalists outside the FLDS to kind of get a handle on here. I think we've shown where things can go off the rails, right? Overbearing, anytime someone tries to infringe upon your agency. And look, I count holding your family hostage as an infringement of your agency, right? Anytime you
right.
can't speak out against an individual because you're afraid of the pushback, that's an issue. That's 100% an issue. Um,
Hmm.
and how certain doctrines and ideas can set us up for failure, if you will. With that said, and you have a uh, a perspective here on the FLDS that I certainly do not, that many of my listeners do not. How is it we as fundamentalists on the outside of the FLDS Church, what can we do to help those who are still there? Is there anything we can do?
I would say perhaps the best thing is to be inviting, and there's a stigma attached to the FLDS that's really hard to get past.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't blame people for the prejudice they feel. I really don't, because we stood up for what went on for way too long. And I'll say the people are very ignorant of what's going on still in the FLDS. For the most part, they believe the very same things you and I do still.
Sure.
And if they can see, especially as things accelerate and continue to fall apart there, that there are people that still live the gospel the way they hope to all their lives, there is I think, a very good chance that more of them will come and want to live the way we're living instead of throwing it all away as they learn the truth. So I think being inviting and ready to help them understand. And it's really hard to come out and have people start pointing at you and say, hey, you guys are believing this crazy thing and that crazy thing. You're all wrong. We're right. That's really hard and a really quite a turnoff for people to
Mm-hmm.
hear. So the invitation is probably one of the biggest things, the kindness, realizing that we aren't out here to destroy them. We're not out trying to take their lives. We're not trying to take their homes. We're just here to help and to live the gospel, to rub shoulders.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on something so important, right? Is this idea of not scoffing at somebody for what they believe in, at that moment. I am a walking example of a guy who's evolved in my beliefs, right? Not like the Darwin kind of evolved, but as you gain, I gotta clarify that. As you get more light and knowledge, things become more readily apparent, right? And
Hmm.
so often we want to use that as that knowledge we have is kind of a badge of honor, right? And I've always said within the gospel of Jesus Christ, those who have more knowledge should be the greatest of servants, right? That's really what we're called to do is to point others towards Christ. And you're not going to be able to be an effective servant by telling someone, "Hey, I told you so," or telling someone how weird their beliefs are, right? I
Right.
think we have a task in front of us that is one of service to our brothers and sisters who were caught in that I'm sorry, that horror show that we have to really minister to now in a very effective way. And we're gonna have to kind of be on our game.
Right.
Where does the group stand now? Where does the FLDS stand now? What's their membership look like? What are they up to these days?
So when I left in May of 2023, uh, the membership, the amount of people still supporting stood at around 5,000.
About half.
And yes, and then real faithful members were about half that number, the loyal and faithful. And there's always a bleeding every year, more come out. And there's not really any children being born. So the group's not growing. And there's for sure no converts. Nobody's going to join something that's going on like that. So the group's slowly breaking down, but there's still a lot of people there. And they're probably the people that are the most faithful and grounded in the gospel, I would say, as far as their beliefs. They're the ones that have been the strongest in not giving up, even if some of what they believe is in error. And that's why I feel a lot of hope for a lot of people there that would still come out and continue to live the gospel if they could just see through the darkness, see the light through the darkness. And there's still a path forward for them to fulfill what they feel like is their mission of being a group of people that are living the gospel in preparation for Christ's second coming.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this, Ammon. Do you ever get emails of people from the group that are wanting to leave?
Every once in a while, I get people asking questions. And generally, if someone in the group wants to ask you a question, they probably won't tell you their name
Okay,
until they really get grounded in what the choice they're going to make.
gotcha. Gotcha. So just being available is the best way to help.
Very, very good thing to be available and willing to listen and not laugh at what they have to say, because some of it might sound kind of funny at first.
Sure.
And that's just the result of the isolation and being taught that everyone is out to get you, and the world's and everybody besides them is trying to destroy them. That's what all those children have grown up being told.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Whew. So with all this said, I want to ask you this question in conclusion. Well, before I do that, I do want to dive into the doctrine a little more. Is there anything else that you can think of that your father or grandfather or others in the FLDS taught that would seem foreign or that had issues attached with it? We talked about the nature of God. We talked about plural marriage, um, and that sort of placement marriage and that sort of thing. Is there any other big
Yes,
doctrines that they taught that you could obviously see now are false?
I brought up that part in the atonement where he claims he atones, and
Right.
the basis of that comes from the split in the 1980s. And my grandfather started teaching that. So in 3rd Nephi 21, Jesus is talking to the Nephites and he mentions something about the marred servant.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandfather started to tell the people that Leroy Johnson was the marred servant that was spoken of in 3rd Nephi 21 by the Savior. And, Leroy Johnson had the shingles and suffered a lot before he died. And they began to claim it was some sort of atonement. Well, my father took that scripture in the Book of Mormon and applied that to his father and later to himself, that he's the marred servant.
Mm.
And that meant that he was suffering an atonement in his capacity like Jesus did. So that's another thing that an FLDS person would quote to you. Will say, if you're starting to question things, they'll say, well, what about the marred servant in 3rd Nephi 21? Who else could that be? And I mean, it's just fine if someone says, I don't know. And there's a lot of people that feel like that marred servant is a reference to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing I felt like was way off. and gave them their groundwork to claim that these men were actually atoning.
Right. Okay. So if you could go back in time and you could talk to your 14-year-old self who just showed up to Texas, what would you tell him?
Boy, that's a hard one.
I know.
Because there's so much experience stacked in there. There's experiences I'm grateful I had that helped me learn and grow, and then a lot of experience that I probably have been okay without. But I would tell myself that it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to study the scriptures and to understand why we live the way we do, and to find out if what you're living is actually the right thing. It's okay to learn that as a young person and have the courage to stand up when you see things are wrong and go choose the right and make an effort to find what is right so that you can go to that source, whatever it is. Because I would never want to tell myself you can just leave.
Right.
Because the implications of that can be huge, especially if you give up on the gospel in your confusion.
I think you hit on something so important right there, right? Because for those of us who were on the outside of that, who were never in the FLDS church, we don't understand just how tightly the gospel was woven into the whoever the current leader was of the group, right? And so this idea
Right.
of, well, why don't you just leave? Well, you can't just leave or else you're damned, right?
Yeah.
There's no other word for it. You are damned. You will lose your family. Everything that you hold dear will be gone.
Right.
And
And you
so,
almost lose your identity.
yeah, you don't really, and again, you can please correct me here if I say anything wrong, but you really don't have an identity. Your identity is formed through that one man. Is it, does that make
Right.
sense?
Correct.
And so you don't really have the identity of your own, right? Um, it is absolutely dependent upon that guy who's on top that helps frame your point of reference about who you are.
Right.
In the case of the FLDS Church, right? I want to be careful here. I don't want to throw all one man churches under the bus, right? Um, but it does lend itself to this sort of thing happening, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and we have to be super cognizant of that. We have to be able to separate that. And I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Is again with that whole leaving thing. For those of us who've been on the outside and are used to exercising our own agency, it does seem like a reasonable question. Why don't you just leave? But it's not a reasonable question to those on the inside who've been victimized for years. Um,
Right. It's real similar to letting a caged animal outside suddenly. They don't
right.
even know what to do.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
I want to add in here the difference between Joseph Smith and what he set up and what you find in the FLDS is Joseph Smith was accountable. He could be held accountable if he went astray
Yeah.
by a council of priests with the presiding bishop. In the FLES, you cannot hold your leader accountable if he goes astray. There's no way to do it. And any council he set up, we're just there to raise their hand and say yes to whatever he said, or else they got sent away. So there's zero accountability for him. What Joseph Smith set up, there is accountability. And that's a massive difference there.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting observation because look, we know, and I want to say this, it was unjust, but we do know that Joseph did submit to church inquiries, right? He did he did go before certain men to make an account of stuff. And I do
Right.
find that interesting that Joseph never put himself above the law, so to speak, but yet other men who came saying they were his successor did take that stance.
Right.
That's
Joseph was willing to raise men up to his knowledge and to his stature. He brought men that were strong and made them apostles, gave
Yep.
them positions in the church. He didn't feel threatened by them. And you see the opposite when a man takes power legitimately. He feels threatened constantly. Therefore, he constantly gets rid of any man he considers a threat.
Yeah. Phew. That's a deep observation. That's good, Ammon. And I think what you said there too is so vitally important is that you don't have to start at almost zero or at zero, but you got to get close, right? You got to be willing. And that's one of the things that's jumping out at me here as we've had our conversation is that in your case, you were willing to be like, okay, I've received a testimony about Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith's prophetic role. Let's anchor to that and then let's rebuild, right? And
Right, correct. That's exactly the
I find it very interesting that as we've talked about it, right? And if you don't build on that foundation, you're going to be weak, right? There's no way around it. The foundation is there to give it strength. And so being able to have that foundation is super super important. And also the other thing that you said that I really liked is to question, right? So often I think in religion that we view questions as a sign of weakness. And what I've come to understand a lot of times is that questions are often a barometer of where you're at in your faith, right? It's often an indication of how mature you are eh, based on the questions you asked, right? And let's not forget that Mormonism starts with a question, right? Mormonism
You're
starts
right,
with
exactly.
Joseph Smith going to the grove after having read the Bible and going, "What church do I join?" Right? That's how this whole thing starts, is with a question.
Right.
And if anybody tells you, "Well, don't question, just trust me," that's when you should question the most. The most
100%.
is when you should question. Because if someone's telling you just take your word for it, that's concerning, right? In matters of your faith, in matters of your eternal consequence, you take that to God, right? And I'm not saying that you can't have trusted confidants around you and friends to help you keep you on the path. But if someone says, "No, no, don't worry about what the book says. Just listen to me and I'm going to get you there." That's when you should even ask questions even more. And I do feel like in Mormonism, we have been blessed with enough information, as you've attested to here, Ammon, right? We have the Journal of Discourses, right? And there's a lot of great things in there, right? I would also say some of it,
Right.
is just dudes talking, right? Which is cool to look at. But there is a lot of doctrine in there that we can look at and glean a lot of information from that can help reinforce good doctrine and good ideas. And so
Right.
they're absolutely out there. One final question. What would you say to anyone who's going to hear this that might still be in the FLDS church?
I would say there's a lot of hope for you to continue to live the gospel, even if you choose to step outside of that group, see the light, see what's happened in the FLDS for what it is, and you still want the gospel. There's a lot of people willing to help you come to understand it's 100% okay to ask questions and to reground yourself in the gospel and come to a knowledge of the truth for yourself. I mean, go back to Joseph Smith. Why did he go to the grove to pray? He read, if any man lacketh wisdom, let him ask of God, who won't upbraid him, but will give to him liberally. And that's the kind of God we worship, not one who demands you don't ask questions of anyone in authority or who you think is in authority. And then he won't consider you a wicked person for what you may think are small infractions. And I can't emphasize enough in the group the fear that God is angry over very small matters when he is not. He's a kind and loving God that is right there just waiting for us to reach out. A lot of people wonder why he hasn't answered the prayers for their prophet to be delivered. And I would say he answered those prayers the day he allowed him to be arrested. Because if you understood the depth of darkness he was promising to come teach, which we did not understand at the time, but he had stated a few weeks before he was caught, he would come to the temple and start to teach us new things and bring us into God's presence. Well, if we realized the darkness of what he was going to start teaching, we'd look upon that time as the answer to those prayers. And God did deliver us, and he's just waiting for us to come back to him and
Wow.
let him tell us where to go.
Wow. I'm going to say this and then I'll let you have the last word here, Ammon. But for anybody out there who's caught in anything like this, whether it be in the FLDS Church or another church that is doing this, reach out. There are people here that want to help, who are uniquely positioned to help. You reach out to me. I'll put you in contact with someone close to you that can help. You want to talk to Ammon? I'm sure he's willing to talk to you. Whoever, just reach out so we can help. There, you don't have to abandon all your beliefs. Like Ammon was saying, probably 95% of the stuff that we believe is similar, right? And while that 5% seems small, it's exaggerated because the consequences and the stakes are so high. But my point is, you don't have to give up Mormonism. You shouldn't give up Mormonism. Look, Mormonism, when practiced correctly and taught correctly, is the most freeing of theologies that I have come across, bar none. It is the ability to approach God and know God will answer you. Reach out and we will make it happen however it needs to. We can get you out of it. We can help you. And all you got to do is reach out. I'm here. There's others that I know that are willing to assist in helping you come out of that darkness because you don't have to stand there. You don't have to sit in it. And that would be the last thing I'd want to end with is there's hope outside of this. And all things can be made right. All things through the atonement of Christ can be made correct. Even your most dire sufferings can be relieved by him. And I just want to leave that with everyone in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Ammon, it's yours to finish up tonight, bud.
Amen. Thank you. I think you nailed it on the head. And I'd add one thing. When someone comes out, they generally have a lot to unload. And it takes a patient listening person to hear them out. But I think you nailed it, Dave. And I just thank for letting me be on here with you. Really enjoy this podcast.
Oh, well,
Couldn't recommend it more to anyone that wants to understand our history and our roots. A lot of good source material here.
well, I sure appreciate you for being so brave to come on. I think you're a good man, Ammon. I know you're a good man. I felt it here. And we should do one of these again when you have a topic in mind. Just give me a
Yeah, we
call.
should.
We should get back on. You should come out and check out Missouri. We'll throw some
I know, I
steaks.
need to.
Yeah, we'll throw some steaks on the grill. We'll hang out. We'll have a good time. You should come out and hang out for a little while. So I think we could have a good
Okay.
time.
Hey, well, if I come that way, I'll let you know. I'll hit you up.
Yeah, you got my number, man. Anytime you need, give me a call.
Okay. Hey,
Awesome.
thanks a ton.
Ammon, you're awesome. I think you got a lot of good work left ahead of you, brother. I'm excited to see where you go. I really am. Thank you again so much for coming on. This it's one of those things that's tough to look at. It's got to be even tougher to talk about from your side. So I appreciate your grace and your strength and your courage. So because there was a lot of it on display tonight.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dave.
All right, man. Good stuff. Let's do it again soon.
Okay. All
All
right.
right. Bye, everybody.
We'll see ya.